right, if you're like me, you tuned into the internet today to find out that two missiles had hit Poland and tragically had killed two people. But then you heard about this Article 5 from NATO and everybody started panicking. And that would be because Article 5's only ever happened one time in the history of NATO, and that was for the proceedings after 9/11 and when the planes hit the Twin Towers. Luckily, Poland has decided to go with Article 4 and has brought the members of NATO to the table to discuss in what is called the consultation process. So I wanted to unpack with you guys a little bit more about Article 4, what it actually is, when it's being used in the past, and what I think that this could potentially mean for us moving forward. But first, I wanted to share with you directly from NATO what Article 4 actually is. So let's take a look. All NATO decisions are made by consensus after discussion and consultation among member countries. Consultation between member states is therefore at the heart of NATO, since allies are able to exchange views and information and discuss issues prior to reaching agreement of taking action. I think that's really important because this actually means that all NATO members need to come together, sit at the table, and actually discuss what is going to be a course of action when something like this happens. And I think that's very important because as we show in a little bit here, every time Article 4 has happened, there is military action taken. There's never been no military action that follows up Article number 4. So here we go. I'm going to continue reading through NATO's website here so that you guys get an understanding of what Article 4 actually is and what it really means. So they go on to say consultation takes many forms. At its most basic level, it involves simply the exchange of information and opinions. At another level, it covers the communication of actions or decisions which governments have already taken or may be about to take. Finally, it can encompass discussion with the aim of reaching a consensus on policies to be adopted or actions to be taken. So this is kind of interesting because this just discussed right here decisions that governments have already taken or may be about to take. And that's kind of interesting because the entire point of consultation inside NATO is to actually reach a consensus with the North Atlantic Council. And that's what gives the NATO countries the power and final decision to actually take a course of action. And what this says here is they really are going to get together to talk about actions that have already been taken or maybe about to take place. So kind of interesting little side note there, but I'll continue on. In sum, consultation is continuous and takes place both on a formal and informal basis. It can happen quickly due to the fact that all member states have a permanent delegation at NATO headquarters in Brussels. Governments can come out together at short notice whenever necessary, often with prior knowledge of their respective national preoccupations in order to agree on common policies or take action on the basis of consensus. I think that's really clever because speed is often going to be very important with these global conflicts, but it's also great to get these people talking as soon as possible so that the speed is not found on the battleground, right? You want speed to be speed to discussion and then take longer because of that speed to be able to actually deliberate sensible options. So I think that's important. And while I'm filming this, the G20 is actually going on in Indonesia. So obviously the world's leaders are also going to be there. But it is great to hear that they have delegations at headquarters of NATO in Brussels so that they can quickly react to this type of thing and start creating a plan. And I think a plan is what's necessary here, not necessarily a knee-jerk reaction. And I think that's what scared people when we started hearing about Article 5, which was, it sounded like that was on the table for a moment before any investigations had formally gone on with this missile strike. So definitely good to hear that consultation is the right answer. So NATO says here, the principle of consensus decision-making is applied throughout NATO, which means that all NATO decisions are the expression of the collective will of all sovereign states that are members of this intergovernmental organization. While consensus decision-making can help a member country preserve national sovereignty in the area of defense and security, Article 4 can be an invitation for member countries to concede this right to the group, or it can simply lead to a request for NATO support. I think that's good to discuss as well. It's kind of strange to concede the right to the group to me, because obviously there are multiple stakeholders here and everybody will be motivated by different things. Ultimately, the country that is invoking Article number 4 is probably most concerned with their security, whereas the other countries are probably concerned with things like resources, military deployments, and other, political relationships that they have throughout the world. So Yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting here. The nice thing is that it is apparently consensus decision making. So all of the countries kind of need to agree on a path. And there are some critics to NATO that say this is essentially just an anti Russia type of organization, but I'm not really sure. And I don't have my opinion fully formed on that yet. So I'm going to keep reading here on at least what Article 4 is. And then we can talk about some other times that it's been invoked. This line I thought perfectly summed up what is actually going on with Article 4. And it says, the parties will consult together whenever, in the opinion of any of them, the territorial integrity, political independence, or security of any of the parties is threatened. And I think that's important. So I would say that a couple of missiles hitting your country and actually killing two civilians, is definitely cause for security issues. And there are some speculation as to whether or not this was Ukrainian anti-air defense, or whether these were rockets that were meant for Ukraine and just sort of got off course. So I think that the jury's still very much out on that. But I'm glad that Article 4 is where we're going, because this is really just all about consultation. So any member country can formally invoke Article 4 of the North Atlantic Treaty. As soon as it is invoked, the issue is discussed and could potentially lead to some form of joint action or action on behalf of the alliance. So I think that's important. Any member can invoke this thing, but when they do, everybody has to come to the table and they need to discuss what is a great course of action on behalf of the alliance. Since the alliance's creation in 1949, Article 4 has been invoked 7 times. On 24th of February 2022, Bulgaria, Chechnya, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, and Slovakia requested to hold consultations under Article 4 following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So we're talking there about what's recently been going on, and this is obviously the next time now that this is being invoked. This is the 7th time, is the current issue now with Poland, and it's Poland invoking it, discussing the missiles that hit their citizens. On the 26th of July 2015, Turkey made the same request in view of the seriousness of situation following terrorist attacks and to inform allies of the measures it was taking. Poland invoked Article 4 on the 3rd of March 2014 following increasing tensions in neighboring Ukraine as a result of Russia's aggressive actions. On 2 occasions in 2012, Turkey requested a North Atlantic Council meeting under Article 4, once on June 22nd, and essentially after its fighter jet was shot down by Syrian air defense forces, and the second time on the 3rd of October when 5 Turkish civilians were killed by Syrian shells. Following these incidents on November 21st, Turkey requested the deployment of Patriot missiles. NATO agreed to this defensive measure so as to help Turkey defend its population and territory and help de-escalate the crisis along the border. That operation, I do believe, was called Operation Active Fence, if you guys want to look up that. Previously as well, on the 10th of February 2003, Turkey formally invoked Article 4, asking for consultations in the North Atlantic Council on defensive assistance from NATO in the event of a threat to its population or territory resulting from an armed conflict in neighboring Iraq. NATO agreed to a package of defensive measures and conducted Operation Display Deterrence from the end of February to early May 2003. And some of these other operations, like Operation Active Fence that started in 2012, is actually still an active mission for NATO, and that's going on now 10 years later, where they're still looking at trying to secure Turkey. Further on down the article here, in regards to Article 4, NATO talks about a direct method of bringing home to the public opinion the importance and habit of political consultation within NATO may be summed up in the proposition: NATO is a political as well as a military alliance. The habitual use of this phraseology, I've never heard phraseology before, are we still doing phrasing? Would be preferable to the current tendency to refer to NATO as a purely military alliance. It is also more accurate. To refer to NATO as a political alliance in no sense denies, depreciates, or deprecates the fact that the alliance is also military. So NATO is really a political and a military alliance. And I think that that's important because when we're talking about consultation, we're talking about communication, we're talking about consensus, we're generally speaking talking about politics, right? We're not necessarily talking directly about the military tactics that they're going to take from this. But like we've seen with Operation Display Deterrence, with Operation Active Fence, and with the different material support that's been sent to Ukraine in response to the Russian invasion, often the politics do translate into military responses. So ultimately, I think what we can say here is that NATO Article 4 is really the formal act of bringing all the countries to the table to come up with a consensus plan of action as to what they're actually going to do when something like this happens. So we've had missiles enter Poland, 2 people were murdered. That's very, tragic and sad, but now these countries need to move forward and they need to decide as a group, what do we actually do about this? And I would think that a large-scale investigation would be required, and I would think that that would be the first step to actually figuring out, where do we take this thing, and hopefully this doesn't result in all-out war with Russia, because that doesn't seem like a favorable outcome for any of the countries involved here. Another just final note here on Article 4. The Committee of Three left a lasting legacy by encouraging NATO members to reconcile differences within the organization through productive consultation on matters of common concern, including issues outside the defined NATO area. The Suez crisis provided a first-hand example of why close political consultation and non-military cooperation, non-military cooperation, you guys see that right here on the NATO website, non-military cooperation is necessary. Okay, Suez Canal could have turned into a real mess. That could have turned into all-out war, but it didn't because political consultation and non-military cooperation were used. That's important. We don't want to go to war with one of the countries that holds the biggest nuclear arsenals, especially when all of the countries that are going to be affected by this through NATO are directly benefiting from the resources that country has. Okay, we're talking about energy crisis right now in Europe. We're talking about people facing an all-time high demand for wood because that's the only way to heat your house when there's no gas available. It's very bad. This is not a good thing. And so the non-military cooperation detailed by the Committee of Three, which was, we don't need to go into the history of the Committee of Three, but essentially they were like, hey, why don't we actually just talk about some of this stuff instead of just launching full-scale military operations? And I think that's pretty sensible. And then finally here, the last thing on the article says, the principal forum for political consultations is the North Atlantic Council. Okay, we brought up the North Atlantic Council a couple times already in this article, and it's NATO's principal political decision-making committee. Okay, so the Secretary General, by virtue of his chairmanship, plays an essential part in this process. Consultation also takes place on a regular basis in other fora, including NATO committees and working groups. All of these bodies derive their authority from the Council. But really, I think what we want to focus on here is the idea that, NATO is political and military in nature. Ultimately, they want what's best for all of their countries. And I think what's good to understand about what happened here is all of the world's leaders are at the G20 right now. A lot of key business leaders in the world are at the B20 right now. And I don't think they had their eyes necessarily on Russia during this period of time. They are talking about that at the G20. But what's important here is that NATO and Poland in particular decided to go the route of Article 4, which is that of consultation and consensus of agreement among the NATO members, rather than going Article 5. Article 5 is all about collective defense, and Article 5 has only ever been used one time, and that was for 9/11, after the planes hit the Twin Towers, where all the NATO countries decided, yeah, this is a big issue. We're actually going to go in and invade a country collectively, and that's where when they use the word collective defense, they actually mean that if you attack one of them, it's the same as attacking all of them. And if through a different lens, you guys want to think this through to its natural conclusion, if Poland went right ahead and invoked Article 5 right now, that is the same as saying that those two missiles allegedly from Russia that hit Poland and killed civilians that's the same as saying that those two missiles hit the United States of America. That's the same thing as saying that they hit the UK, right? It hit London or something. That's the same thing as saying that they hit any of the other native countries like the Czech Republic, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, any of those countries. So when you have the collective might of NATO warring against you like that, in the same way that we did see after 9/11, you got to really think of the consequences. I mean, what that translated into was a 20-year war with many, many, many casualties and an extreme amount of cost in both, human life and, financially, as well as just morale. I mean, the whole world was down for 20 years thinking that we were at all-out war, and it really wasn't that fun. But just to sum up Article 5 and why it was great that we avoided that here, here's what NATO has to say about Article 5. Collective defense means that an attack against one ally is considered as an attack against all allies. The principle of collective defense is enshrined in Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. NATO invoked Article 5 for the first time in its history after the 9/11 terrorist attacks against the United States. NATO has taken collective defense measures on several occasions, including the response to the situation in Syria and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. NATO has standing forces on active duty that contribute to the alliance's collective defense efforts on a permanent basis. And one thing that I did want to bring up here was the 3,000 troops to deploy to Poland, as the White House says Russia could invade Ukraine within the week. And this was an article that's actually now it's stale dated, but what this is referring to is actually the Joint Task Force troops that are available to be deployed at any time. And so they actually have tens of thousands of these troops ready at any time. And this was, again, a stale article before the invasion of Ukraine. And what I wanted to really talk about here was, if Poland had went the Article 5 route, like, it's not like it would take very long for an all-out war to just happen. And unfortunately, with the fog of war, we've seen that this can lead to bad decision making. This can lead to rash decisions. This can lead to overplaying one's hand. And we really don't want that, because what this could inevitably escalate to is things like nuclear war. And what I'm hoping is that with Article 4, when we have all the leaders of these countries and their delegates talking together in one room at a circle table, where they're all of equal power and they must come to consensus, I'm really hoping that this leads us to a productive conversation about the conflict in Russia and what's going to actually play out there. And hopefully we can discuss things like the total cost of going to war with a country as large and as powerful and as resource rich as Russia. And of course, too, we just saw Xi Jinping, the Chinese, the fuck is he called? Is he an emperor? I don't even know what he is. But Xi Jinping, he was just talking to Joe Biden and telling him and encouraging him strongly to back off from this war. I mean, nobody wants this war, and Russia does have allies. So I'm really excited that we were able to see NATO deliberate and in Poland to invoke Article 4, but we're going to have to stay closely tuned into this and see what actually comes of that. But yeah, that's it for me. That's it for today, guys. NATO Article 4. This is all about getting NATO to the table. It's all about reaching consensus. It's all about consultation, and that is much better than being all about war.